So it turns out we've started the year of our Lord 2026 with an actual bang as Donald Trump and the Americans launch precision military strikes on Venezuela to depose the drug lord-in-chief dictator Nicolás Maduro, reshaping the geopolitical landscape as we know it, and commies across the world lose their minds. And it has serious ramifications for Canada. It's January the 10th. I'm Matthew Hallick, and this is Liberty Dispatch. Well, hey, and welcome back to the Dispatch, my friends. It's great to be joined by you as I embark on this year. This is a solo journey for our first new episode of 2026, but thank you. Welcome back to Liberty Dispatch. On today's show, we've got massive things happening in the world stage and none bigger than the U.S. intervention in Venezuela with the removal and arrest of Nicolás Maduro, the drug pin overlord, altogether really bad guy who was running Venezuela, and what the intervention of America in Venezuela reveals about power, order, and the return of an oft-forgotten American foreign policy, namely the DONroe Doctrine, or as Donald Trump renamed it, the DONroe Doctrine. But before we get into the headlines, I want to remind you that our show today is brought to you by a wonderful sponsor, our favorite, Rocklinc Investment Partners. Despite mounting pressure in recent years, DEI and ESG initiatives remain deeply entrenched and actively promoted by major financial institutions and investment firms. These divisive ideologies could be channeling your hard-earned dollars towards causes that clash with your core values. Protect your investments and assure they align with your principles. Rocklinc Investment Partners are committed to guiding Christians in building a secure financial future while investing in harmony with their faith and biblical stewardship. Do yourself a favor. Reach out to Rocklinc 905-631-5462 or email them at info@rocklinc.com. That is link with a C. Don't sleep on that today. Well, here we are. Now we get to the headlines. Late last week, the world woke up to a seismic development in the Western Hemisphere. A U.S. military operation deep inside Venezuelan territory. In the wee hours of January 3rd, 2026, the United States Department of Defense launched a military operation inside Venezuela.
Mira, pero ven acá, no se metan para acá, no saben lo que hay ahí que se está aquí. Sí.
Marico, no puedo creer esta mierda.
Marico, tú me estás jodiendo.
Marico, tengo el corazón mío.
Ya, marico.
Llama ya mismo.
Bueno, puede ser.
¿Y pillaste?
No voy a ir al lado de Fortuna, weón.
Marico, se me quedó siempre el puto teléfono.
¿Te están grabando?
Sí, sí.
The precision strike culminated in the removal and arrest of dictatorial President Nicolás Maduro, who now faces charges in the United States on narcotics and terrorism offenses. According to the Associated Press, the administration justified the action as necessary, quote, to deliver justice and to defeat narco crime networks operating in the region, and claimed its intent was to oversee the transition toward a government aligned with Western interests. In doing so, President Trump invoked the guiding logic of the DONroe Doctrine, asserting that the United States would temporarily administer the country and ensure a transition to a more pro-Western government. Maduro's seizure and transfer to New York to face narcotics and terrorism charges has set off a geopolitical firestorm and has made one Zoran Mamdani, the new communist mayor of New York, a little bit upset. Nevertheless, the swift action took the world by storm. For Venezuelans, the news of Maduro's fall brought great joy. Within hours of reports that Nicolás Maduro had been removed from power, video began circulating on social media, showing crowds in parts of Caracas and other cities cheering, honking car horns, waving flags, and celebrating openly.
Venezuela será libre. Gracias, Trump, gracias.
La verdad es que contento, feliz, alegre, con ganas de llorar.
Y agradecer a los Estados Unidos, al presidente Trump, por su decisión, por su fuerza y por defender la libertad y defender la democracia.
¡Estoy feliz! ¡Feliz como una lombriz!
Bandera de los Estados Unidos se puede ver porque es eso también lo que les da la alegría, dicen ellos.
Esta es la mejor noticia que ha recibido Venezuela en sus últimos 26 años.
¿Qué te parecen las declaraciones de Donald Trump que dio hace poco, que ellos van a tomar el control del país, que van a esperar una transición política? ¿Qué te parece?
Me parece excelente, ya es hora de que como venezolanos seamos libres.
Esta era la única manera que una narcotiranía saliera del poder.
¿Se respalda la decisión de Trump, lo que hizo la decisión?
Claro, por supuesto, mejor que estar en comunismo.
However, there still remains many in Venezuela who are trepidatious about the current events, especially given the fact that many of Maduro's closest henchmen, including his vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, is still in power. So it has left the world wondering what is up. And many, in response to Trump's decisive action, many across the world have condemned their action as illegal and unjust. Here, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, quoted widely in international outlets, including Reuters, he had this to say. I remind you that Guterres himself is a commie. Quote, U.S. actions had worrying implications for the region, constitute a dangerous precedent, and that the rules of international law have not been respected. Senator Bernie Sanders on the 3rd, just after the events themselves, had this to say. I remind you, Bernie, also communist. President Trump's unilateral military action against Venezuela is illegal and unconstitutional. It violates international law, endangers global security, and usurps Congress's exclusive authority to declare war. The United States does not have the right to run Venezuela. Sanders continued, this brazen violation of international law gives a green light to any nation on earth that may wish to attack another country to seize their resources or change their governments. This is rank imperialism. It will and should be condemned by the democratic world. Spoke of newly elected communist mayor of New York, Zoran Mamdani. He calls himself a socialist, but socialists are communists, right? Socialism is the intermediary stage to a communist utopia. We understand that. This is what Zoran Mamdani had to say. Quote, the American strikes on Venezuela and the abduction of Maduro are an act of war and a violation of federal and there you go. International law and a clear attempt to change the regime. How about Sunny Hostin, co-host of The View? Quote, the capture of Maduro was kidnapping. It was an illegal act. And the United States has engaged in piracy by seizing Venezuelan leaders without congressional authorization or international legal basis. Interestingly enough, this is the exact same reaction that malign state actors like, you guessed it, China and Russia have articulated. Here's the People's Republic of China, Chinese Foreign Minister, spokesperson Mao Ning, January 7th, 2026. The forcibly seizing President Maduro and his wife is in clear violation of, you guessed it, international law, basic norms in international relations, and the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. China strongly condemns this because they love international law and human rights. China does, yes. And again, from the same briefing, the U.S. blatantly used force against Venezuela and asked the country to, quote, favor America with regard to its oil's reserves. Such bullying seriously breaches, you guessed it, international law, infringes on Venezuelan sovereignty, and violates the rights of the Venezuelan people. Amazing. This is an official Chinese government position citing international law and sovereignty. Here's what Russia had to say. Russia, you know, those guys who are currently aggressively trying to take over the Ukraine. This is what they had to say at an emergency UN Security Council meeting, as reported internationally. This is a quote. Representatives of Russia condemn the U.S. actions as a violation of international law. I mean, did everybody get the same script? And Venezuelan sovereignty, calling for Maduro's release. Russia's diplomatic representatives used precisely those terms. International law and sovereignty in condemning the operation. And whether you agree or disagree with the U.S.'s action in Venezuela, the response is rather telling. And that's what I want to talk about. The United States government says it's acted in the interests of security, law enforcement, and regional stability. Its critics, however, many of whom call this an imperial overreach and a violation of sovereignty, well, they invoke international law to do so. So let us look at these competing claims. This is what I want to look at. So to better understand these competing claims, we have to understand what is the DONroe Doctrine, or as Trump called it, the DONroe Doctrine. What is that? And what is international law? Because we have two competing claims. Let's search them out. Let's weigh them in the balance, shall we? So first, let's start with the DONroe Doctrine. So the DONroe Doctrine, 1823, was a declaration by President James Monroe that essentially stated the Western Hemisphere was closed to further European colonization or political interference at that time. Okay? It asserted that the Americas were a distinct strategic region, and those old European powers, many of them that were mercantilists, who loved to scoop up new territory for economic interests, well, they weren't welcome to intervene. The U.S. would oppose foreign encroachment in its hemisphere, okay? So this is actually what the doctrine itself says. So here's a few select quotes. The American constituents, by the free and independent condition which they have assumed and maintained, are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for further colonization by any European powers. The citizens of the United States cherish sentiments the most friendly in favor of the liberty and happiness of their fellow men on this side of the Atlantic. We owe it, therefore, to candor and to the amicable, relations existing between the United States and those powers to declare that we should consider any attempt on their part, that's the Europeans' part, to extend their system to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety. We could not view any interposition for the purpose of oppressing them or controlling in any other manner their destiny by any European power in any other light than as the manifestation of an unfriendly disposition towards the United States. So this is what a very important part here. Our policy in regards to Europe, which was adopted at an early stage of the wars, which have so long agitated that quarter of the globe, Europe, nevertheless remains the same, which is not to interfere in the internal concerns of any of its powers, to consider the government de facto as legitimate government for us, to cultivate friendly relations with it, and to preserve those relations by frank, firm, and manly policy, meeting in all instances the just claims of every power, submitting to injustices from none. It is still the true policy of the United States to leave the parties to themselves in hope that other powers will pursue the same course. So that's rather interesting, to say the least. Essentially, the doctrine, the DONroe Doctrine, was a neighborhood claim. Nothing more, nothing less. It wasn't about global geopolitical conquest or expansion. It was about regional order, a principle committed to keeping peace and security in the Western Hemisphere. It was also not a new assertion. Rather, the DONroe Doctrine was entirely consistent with the foreign policy of the United States at its founding, which was essentially the civic instantiation of Romans 12:18. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. So that was the state of affairs. 1823 onward, this official government foreign policy of the United States of America. Now, interestingly, in 1904, you have what is later called the Roosevelt Corollary, named after President Teddy or Theodore Roosevelt, and he added enforcement. He explicitly stated that chronic instability in the Americas could invite malign global actors to intervene in the Western Hemisphere, and that the United States would purposefully act in ways that would prevent such action, including, if necessary, God forbid, if necessary, military force. So of note, both of these more American foreign policy positions predate the League of Nations, the UN, and even the Genevan Conventions. Thus, it dates the so-called international law. And this is essentially what the DONroe Doctrine is in 2026. It is, as articulated by the U.S. National Security Strategy in 2025, the same policy as the DONroe Doctrine with its Rooseveltian corollary. And I want to read to you about Roosevelt himself, okay? Because there's very important things for us to understand. Roosevelt's posture towards foreign nations might be summed up by this saying: speak softly and carry a big stick. So that's the peace through strength strategy. Roosevelt assured the rest of the world, this is his corollary, that his country had no territory ambitions in the Western Hemisphere, but chronic wrongdoing or impotence, which results in a general loosening of the ties of civilized society. The situation may ultimately require intervention by some civilized nation, and in the Western Hemisphere, the adherence of the United States to the DONroe Doctrine may force the United States, however reluctantly, right, that's the God forbid, to the exercise of an international police power. Very, very interesting. The United States would protect the territorial integrity and nationhood of Latin American countries from outside interference and intervene in the affairs when it judged that to be necessary. So there you have it. That's the Monroe Declaration with the Roosevelt corollary, which is the DONroe strategy of foreign policy, which, as Roosevelt says, speak softly, carry a big stick. And that is Donald Trump's peace through strength model. But let us now examine so-called international law. The UN in international law has its origins essentially in 1945, predated with the League of Nations, but essentially what we're talking about with the international rule-based order, its origins date back to basically the mid-19th century, the 1900s, I should say. International law, which is also known as public international law, is a body that is of law that governs A, relationships between nations, B, relationships between intergovernmental organizations such as all the alphabet soup organizations, the United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF, all these various things, and relationships between nations and intergovernmental organizations. Some of the primary areas of international law are state sovereignty, human rights, international trade, the use of force and warfare, and the settlement of international disputes between nations. What's important to understand, though, is that international law, which we saw was appealed to over and over and over again in this discussion, is essentially a fiction. It doesn't really exist. Frankly, it's not real law as we would understand it, but a patchwork of political understandings that are often contradictory and weakly enforced. For without a sovereign enforcer, law between states looks more like diplomacy dressed up in legal language than a genuine legal system, right? Because first, no real sovereign equals no real sanctions. Classical legal theory defines law as a command of a sovereign backed by sanctions. On that definition, international law fails because there is no global sovereign standing over states, except for God, that is. There's no ruler who can really punish states. It takes the member states to actually do that. So it's important to understand that international law, so-called, is, as you can tell by that definition, is globalist in nature. It appeals to extrajudicial supranational organizations as arbiters of the conduct of nations. And it's not neutral in its assessment, let me tell you, especially as we see that the head of the UN is a commie, okay? The UN and other such globalist regimes have, much to their chagrin, proven time and time again that they are totally inept, incapable of enforcing the global order that they seek. The UN is filled from top to bottom with malign actors who seek to use the UN for their national purposes against the interests of other nations. So it's a fraught relationship between the actual nations in the UN. It has been since the start. It's a disastrous organization. Right, we're talking about the League of Nations built by Woodrow Wilson, who has to be one of the worst presidents in all of American history. And then you have the UN and all its shenanigans that was largely forwarded by guys like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and FDR sucks too. He was basically a commie. The man behind the New Deal and whatever. So when powerful states violate rules, e.g., all these examples of torture, prohibition, aggressive wars, ignoring tribunal rulings, all these things. Consequences are often criticisms or symbolic measures, most of the time like weak sanctions, which look more like obviously political posturing than law, right? Second, enforcement is selective and political. International courts and bodies, the ICJ, the ICC, tribunals, depend on state consent for jurisdiction, funding, arrest powers, and compliance. So they cannot reliably punish any serious violations without cooperation of the very states that they might actually judge. Therefore, enforcement often reflects political power. Take, for instance, permanent members of the UN security can veto actions, shield allies, and ensure that some violations are punished while others are completely ignored, undermining any claim to neutral rule-based enforcement, right? And who are those permanent members? China? That's a bad world actor. Russia? Well, that's a bad one. France, the United Kingdom, and the United States. So it's laughable to say that the UN, with that structure and those different competing national interests, could somehow be an arbiter of the international rule-based order. It's laughable. It's silly. The laws, supposed laws of international rules-based order, I defy you to go check them up and figure out what they actually are. They're fragmented, they're convoluted, and contradictory. The system is unworkable. Compliance depends on interest, not obligation. And obviously, because of the permanent powers of those permanent security members, a lot of the powers that exist within the UN are totally skewed towards the most powerful states. And because most of the states are at odds with each other, what you have is a nation divided against itself. And someone I know once said that is completely untenable.
Inflation through the roof.
Food costs went up 10.6% in February.
Censorship of dissident voices, freezing of bank accounts.
Justin Trudeau invoking emergency powers against the truckers. Banks can now freeze their personal accounts, the accounts of anyone linked to the Freedom Convoy.
Digital surveillance and communism spreading.
What do we want?
Basic income!
With the basic income, I felt a sense of security because I didn't have to worry about not going hungry and I didn't have to worry about being kicked out of my apartment.
The government is on the verge of bankruptcy and they're coming for your money.
Canada's federal debt increasing in real time, now surpassing $1.2 trillion. This debt is draining taxpayer dollars, with interest alone costing $54 billion this year.
It's time to break free and start saving in money they can't take from you. Since 2013, the folks at Bull Bitcoin have one mission: destroy central banking. Bull Bitcoin is the most trusted Bitcoin company in Canada. They empower you to buy, sell, and pay bills with Bitcoin. They are 100% non-custodial, which means that you always maintain full control over your Bitcoin, allowing you to reclaim your financial sovereignty and secure your wealth for the future. Their customer support will assist you throughout the whole process, helping you get your hands on the hardest money ever created. Escape their financial gulag, click on the link below, and start buying Bitcoin today.
So when it comes to who's on firmer footing, I think you all understand who has the better argument. The Trump administration, well, they appeal to American foreign policy positions that are almost 2 centuries old. So is it they who have the better position, or those crying about a supposed violation of so-called international law? It is clear that the Trump administration is on much firmer footing than those who are belly aching over some sort of violation of vague rules-based order that really can't enforce itself. So the point here is this is the peace through strength model that Trump ran on and won on. All right. This is a model totally in line, as I said, with Roosevelt's foreign policy maxim: speak softly and carry a big stick. With that being said, I think it's important for us to know that Roosevelt was an old school, what we call progressive, right? He was one of the presidents within the progressive era, and a marking feature of that progressive era, don't get confused by the term, it's not the exact same thing as modern progressives, okay? But a huge part of that ethos was a strong executive. And because within the U.S. Constitution, the executive is actually the head of the U.S. military, this has obvious foreign policy ramifications. And what that tended to do is create much more executive discretion as it pertains to intervention in other states with military action. So I do tend to agree that this understanding of executive powers, that it's consistent with the underlying progressive ethos. It does chafe against constitutional limits as it was originally intended. But we also have to understand that this type of power that was used by the Trump administration has been used over and over and over again consistently since Roosevelt, by presidents of both parties, were Democrat and Republican. So a lot of the outrage is pretty selective, is what I want you to understand. Now, whether or not it's justified biblically, I do think the Roosevelt corollary is a definitely more interventionist, and it's more expansionistic than the Monroe Doctrine. I think as far as the Monroe Doctrine is concerned, it's thoroughly biblical. It's thoroughly non-interventionist, and I thoroughly support it. Now, the Roosevelt corollary is important, I think, especially within the context of modern warfare, especially fifth generational warfare that doesn't often happen through kinetic means, but through subterfuge and espionage and all these things. I think it's a necessary aspect, a necessary addition, but I would say only if it is well defined in which circumstances that more preemptive power is being used by the executive. And I think within the American system, there is not a well-defined chain put on the executive within that Rooseveltian corollary. So I would agree that that is an issue. But the selective outrage is the problem. And this is what I want to talk about as well, because we need to understand that when we're talking about the Democrats, well, they're the arch progressives. Woodrow Wilson, FDR, they're progressives. They love the executive. Woodrow Wilson hated the Constitution. He thought it was trash. He did everything he could to subvert it. FDR, I mean, he did a lot to subvert the actual constitutional order of the United States of America. So the children, the grandchildren of the Democrats probably should be careful going around criticizing when they have a huge beam hanging out of their eyes, because the Democrats love executive power. Barack Obama ruled and set the precedent for ruling by executive order, right? By a phone and a pen. That's what he said. So it's a little rich to see Democrats, leftists who love massive executive power, massive concentration and centralization of power, decrying when that actually happens. And I think we also need to really have a discussion over the Pax Americana and the hypocritical response of our globalist elites. Because I watched a segment of Power and Politics with Bob Ray and David Cochran when they were outraged at Donald Trump and the Americans, saying that this is our hemisphere.
Sorry, he's been citing President McKinley's tariff policy and now President Monroe's foreign policy, right? And saying that essentially his view is a corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And they put out the State Department put this out on social media today, saying this is our hemisphere. So you see that. I mean, that is not just our country, our self-interest. It is the whole geographic region of spanning multiple continents.
Yeah, but with great respect to the State Department, David, this is our hemisphere. I could put out a little thing on YouTube saying this is my hemisphere. This is our hemisphere. Like, what the hell is this? You can't unilaterally declare that you have unique jurisdiction over an entire half of the world, and all the people who live in that half of the world just have to put up or shut up. And that's not how the world works. It's not how. It's not right. If we go down this path, we're going down a path where there will be no freedom, there will be no rule of law. Nobody is safe. You could get picked up overnight. You could be refused entry to the United States because you allowed some maniac named Bob Ray on your television program. I mean, anything can be justified or thrown up in their face.
And my thoughts were how silly the Americans, how jerkish, how they were for saying that. My response was, how delusional are us Canadians for not understanding that this has been the way that it has been for centuries at this point. And we like it. We welcome it. When it benefits us economically and militarily, we love it. But bring on the Pax Americana. We want to be in that sphere of orbit. But now, when it comes to Orange Man Bad, you know, acting the way that presidents have acted for 2 centuries when it comes to American foreign policy within the Western Hemisphere, all of a sudden we're dumbfounded. And the hypocrisy is even worse, because let's forward all the way to 1947, the Marshall Plan, right? The U.S. poured billions of dollars into Europe, not out of pure altruism, okay, but because post-World War II and World War I, obviously, for that matter, Western Europe was in real trouble. And without stability, it risked falling into the hands of the communists under their influence. And the Marshall Plan traded American economic influence in the rebuilding of Europe for American protection against bad actors in the region, hence with the creation of organizations like NATO, right? So what was the logic behind Marshall? U.S., you're going to be the police force of the world. You're going to ensure the rebuild of Europe. You're going to ensure with your power and your might and your economic, power as well, right? You're going to ensure the international rule-based order can exist, can be built up after 2 massive world wars that left Europe reeling, and the world reeling for that matter. And it's interesting, too, that why were the Americans able to come out of those wars so successfully? Well, it's precisely because of foreign policy that dates back to the Monroe Doctrine. Americans, since Monroe, had been very hesitant to get wrapped up in European wars. And that is why they were late to get involved in both World War I and World War II. Now, I don't want to get into it now because that's beside the point of the program. FDR, he really wanted to get into World War II, so there's some sketchy stuff that went on there. But what I'm trying to say is the ethos of foreign policy in the United States of America has traditionally been non-interventionist. Okay, that's just the way it is. So sorry, Ben Shapiro. Sorry, some of these war hawks. They want to say they're real politique. That is the reality of the situation. Now, you want to say the modern world has changed those things? Sure, make that argument, but that's just the way that it is. But here's my question that I want people to think about and that the elites, I want them to answer, but they won't answer. Why is one exercise of regional power civilized internationalism with the Marshall Plan, but the same logic applied in America's own hemisphere now condemned as imperial aggression? Right? In fact, it's really, really interesting. The Marshall Plan is way more expansive. In fact, the Marshall Plan, in one sense, is the same logic that the police power of Monroe, right? That the Americans would be a policing power, an international policing power. But instead of just in the Western Hemisphere, they were welcomed in with open arms in Europe. So that's more expansive rather than, this is our hemisphere. We are going to be the peacemakers in the Western world. So Eastern world, Europe and Asia, stay out of the hemisphere, because if you come in here and meddle, America's got to say something about that. And I think this is really important for us to understand. So the only difference is essentially the geography and the branding. Many modern critics argue Monroe-style doctrines are illegal. Power must be constrained by international law. Sovereignty must be absolute. But they forget the legal order they appeal to was born inside an American-enforced geopolitical order. That order was maintained through regional dominance, containment, and at times, yes, military intervention. International law has never been self-executing. So the contradiction is this. They condemn the means by which their preferred legal system, international rule-based world order, became possible. Okay, it was built on the strength of America as a police power of the world. This was the transaction that was made to help rebuild Europe with the Marshall Plan. And let's be honest, these same elites who celebrate the Marshall Plan, NATO, the post-war Americana for its economic success, right? For giving the foundations of the international rule-based order, well, they castigate any overt, less expansionistic invocation of regional security as neo-imperialism. But they actually never renounce the logic they previously shared. Now that the same logic is spoken plainly about the Western Hemisphere, the Morality Council is outraged. And that's not ethics, that's histrionics. That's not law, that's a hysterical Trump derangement syndrome. Let's be honest about that. What Trump did in Venezuela was completely consistent with American foreign policy dating back to Monroe and Roosevelt. Okay? That is the reality of the situation. And any failure of the American system and its checks and balances to put further restraint on executive power to make discretionary targeted strikes like we saw in Venezuela, well, that's on the American system to actually do their job and put those restraints, if necessary, upon the executive. But over and over and over again, the courts haven't touched it, and presidents of both parties have used it. So my point here is the hysteric reaction about Orange Man bad because he's done this is overwrought. It's insane. And in Canada, it's reached a new level of insanity because now we're saying, oh, this goes to show that Donald Trump's going to take Canada. People in Canada literally think that Donald Trump is going to, by force of the military, take over Canada. It's absurd. But this is the country we live in. I mean, it is. So here's the simple reality, okay? Venezuela, under the communist dictatorships of Hugo Chavez and Nicolás Maduro, has become a completely failed narco-state. It's a corruptocracy. used by malign actors across the world to undermine U.S. control in the Western Hemisphere and the world over. So under Chavez and Maduro, Venezuela wasn't just corrupt, it became a forward operating space for Russia, China, Iran, and even Hezbollah to push their power and control that was anti-US, anti-Western in the Western Hemisphere. So from a U.S. strategic perspective, especially under Monroe and the Roosevelt corollary, Venezuela had become a platform for extra-hemispheric adversaries, a hub for sanctions, evasion, and illicit finance, a narcotics transit state with state protection, a potential intelligence logistic node near U.S. territory, a failed state that was giving safe harbor to America's most aggressive enemies. This combination crossed a critical threshold, not merely of bad governments, but of foreign-aligned, criminalized state embedded in America's strategic backyard. And we have to understand that Venezuela had posed a hemispheric problem since the 90s, right? And strangely enough, many who are criticizing Trump now, well, they criticized him during his first term for not smacking Venezuela in the mouth because of all the corrupt shenanigans that were going on there, even all the way back to his first term. And now they are talking as though this is just more, it's some neo-colonialist American expansionism. I mean, the inconsistencies are crazy. But again, I want to read this for you. Chronic wrongdoing or an impotence which results in general loosening of the ties of civilized society. The situation may ultimately require intervention by some civilized nation, and in the Western Hemisphere, the adherents of the United States, the DONroe Doctrine, may force the United States, however reluctantly, to the exercise of international police powers. That's the Rooseveltian corollary. And there's no doubt about it. Everybody, regardless of what side, they recognize that Venezuela was that corruptocracy from start to finish. And therefore, because of the many attempts that the Americans had made to, fight back against Venezuela's corruption, ultimately the decision was made to depose Maduro for his crimes against not only the Americans and his bad acting on that stage, but his drug trafficking and ultimately all the various human rights violations, including stealing elections that he engaged in. And I just want to actually point out the fact that the people who are appealing to international law often appeal to Article 2 of the UN Convention, which states all members shall refrain in the international relationships from the threat of use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any nation or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. Now, one would have to say, well, what are the purposes of the United Nations to actually make that make sense? And in the purposes of the United Nations, let's check this out. To maintain international peace and security, and to that end, to take effective collective measures for the prevention and removal of threats to the peace and for the suppression of acts of aggression or other breaches of the peace, and to bring about a peaceful means and in conformity with the principles of justice and international law, adjustments or settlement of international disputes or situations which might lead to the breach of peace. Well, Venezuela has been breaching the peace and undermining the rules-based international order forever and a day now, for decades and decades. To develop friendly relations among nations based on a respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples. Well, wait a second. Didn't Maduro's regime steal multiple elections? They did. And to take other appropriate measures to strengthen universal peace, to achieve international cooperation in solving international problems of economic, social, cultural, and humanitarian character, and in promoting and encouraging respect for human rights. There you go. And for fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, sex, language, and religion. And to be a center of harmonizing the actions of nations to the attainment of these common ends. So, the people who are appealing to 4 are saying, well, this is a violation of international law, despite the fact that all the appeals the Trump administration makes actually are totally in keeping with the purposes, supposedly, of the United Nations. What they're saying, though, is strategically, it didn't have the sanction of the UN Security Council before they took this action. Well, as we pointed out earlier, the Security Council consists of who? It consists of, yes, you guessed it, China and Russia. The very states that have been using Venezuela to undermine and subvert American influence, not only at home or abroad, but at home. That's the reality of the situation. And this really gets to what we've been talking about on the show. When Andrew and I talked about with Sam Cooper, check out that interview. Donald Trump is resetting the geopolitical order. That is what he's doing with his foreign policy strategies. And he's pushing back against especially China on the world stage. China, with their Belt and Road Initiative, has been getting their tentacles across the world. Really, in the same way that kind of economic intervention like the Marshall Plan, which was inappropriate. I don't like the Marshall Plan, right? Here's a really important part. When the right wingers who are really against what's going on, they're against it primarily because they don't want regime change. They don't want nation building. That's not the business of America. It has been the business of America for a long time after the Marshall Plan, but that's not congruent with the DONroe Doctrine and the Roosevelt Corollary. You notice those are defensive, right? Both the Roosevelt Corollary and the DONroe Doctrine are saying, if you come in our hemisphere, if you start messing around, we're going to smack you in the mouth. And we might even have to take preemptive strikes militarily to avoid coercive state action within our hemisphere. But that does not, unlike the Marshall Plan, have anything to do with nation building and policing on the world stage. That is, I think, the important distinction that we need to make. The important distinction that we need to make as those supposedly on the right, I hate those terms, but nevertheless, we have to understand that by way of foreign policy, targeted strikes against malign actors who are subverting peace and tranquility in the Western Hemisphere is not the same thing as ongoing nation building. It's not. One is bad. That's what we're doing pretty much in the Ukraine, let's be honest, as Canadians. One is good. So we have to be able to make that distinction. Now, before I close, I want to say, how does this pertain to Canada? And simply, it pertains to Canada because of the fact that Venezuela happens to be have one of the greatest reserves of crude in the world. And their heavy crude, their sour crude, is very similar to the profile of the oil sands in Calgary, in Alberta, I should say. So there is real economic concern over the fact that the Americans have now regained control of Venezuela's oil capacity in some respects, and they have opened it to companies who are Americans, the ones that built the actual refinement capabilities and the extraction capabilities. And they are, at least that is the thought, going to be able to use Venezuelan oil, although not in the short term. It will take some time to get everything running, to the 4 million capacity that they were hoping for, because basically the communist government of Venezuela didn't know how to run the oil companies, and they had to lessen production. It was a whole disaster. But anyways, not only does it subvert China and Russia from getting the oil that they were getting from Venezuela, which strategically is very beneficial for the United States, undermining those malign actors. But on the positive side, it adds some more chips to the U.S.'s tool belt. And as it pertains to Canada, our utter insane refusal to build pipelines and delay LNG export terminals and all that can put us seriously behind the 8 ball as it pertains to, taking economic advantage of the fact that we are an oil-rich nation. So once again, the insane policies pursued by our liberal elites in Canada might put Canada in economic and geopolitical doghouse. So because of this threat, we've seen people like Pierre Poilievre, Danielle Smith urge Mark Carney to get your stuff together and to approve some pipelines, lest Canada again fall behind the 8 ball and put ourselves seriously at risk. And this is all while, instead of worrying about Canadian policies about our country, Mark Carney once again jet sets across the world to meet with, you guessed it, the globalist elites and China to try and talk about how they can work together to subvert the Americans. And this honestly gets at the heart of what Andrew and I talked with Sam Cooper about. Donald Trump is resetting the geopolitical order. And you have competing interests. You have the globalists who are pushing for a multilateral world where power is dispersed across all these various nations. There's no big central superpower so that they can be the superpower, that these supranational organizations can exert more power and control over the world order. You have nations like Russia and China who are aggressively looking after their national interests. All of these actors want to subvert the United States, who is the actual world superpower. The globalists want to do so by demoralization, by political coercion. They want to have the Americans basically hand over their power. The Chinese, the Russians, Iranians, and the like, they want to take it. And Donald Trump, currently right now, is saying no to both of those. And that's the situation that we find ourselves in. Donald Trump is saying, choose this day, world, who you will serve. Who are you going to work with? Going to work with the Americans? Or are you going to work with the globalists? or the Chinese and the Russian. That is what's being put on the table. And because of the influence of China in Canada, in Latin America, with the BRICS, alliance, within the Western Hemisphere, the United States of America is saying no more. No more. Be gone. And they're showing China, especially with this precision strike, what will happen if you mess with America. That is why I don't think it's inappropriate to say we find ourselves in a new Cold War. That's where we're at. Donald Trump is resetting the world stage. And Canada has to choose who we're going to go with. Our biggest historical partners and allies are who we've benefited economically, militarily for centuries at this point because of that relationship. Or are we going to align ourselves with actors across the world that want to subvert the Pax Americana, the very thing that has benefited Canadians? And are we going to bow the knee to malign actors like China, who unfortunately, as we've seen over and over again, have immense control over Canadian politics? This is what we have to understand. I hope this blessed you. I hope this got you to think about some things that you haven't thought about. And if you have comments, questions, concerns, please make them known. Let's engage in a discussion. Tell me what you think about what happened in Venezuela. Leave that in the comments. And be sure to go over to ldcanada.substack.com if you like what we're doing, because we still got a lot more conversations that we have to release from 350 in their entirety, and you're not going to want to miss them. So be sure to go over there and become a paid subscriber, ldcanada.substack.com, to do just that. Thank you for joining us in 2026. God bless you. And it's for freedom that Christ has set you free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery. Till next time, everybody. God bless.
Liberty Dispatch has been brought to you by SDG Media. If you want to stay in touch with us and all things Liberty Dispatch, join our email list, or support the show, head over to ldcanada.substack.com.